Beyond a Brave New World, Anarchism and Christianity for the Coming Age is brought to you by Iconocast, Jesus Radicals, and Missio Dei.
That never runs dry. You are a stream, you are a stream of water that never runs dry, that never runs dry. You are a stream of water that never runs dry, that never. A little louder, and listen to each other. Thank you. My name's Ched Myers, and I come from Southern California, from the Ventura River watershed. And what I want to do this afternoon is tell a little bit of my story and talk a little bit about a sort of a proposal, a working proposal, and then end up with a little bit of scripture study, because that's another thing I don't think we've had too much of this weekend. I want to begin by just acknowledging my hosts this weekend, Steve and Christine Clemens, if you would raise your hands. They just live a couple of blocks away, members of St. Martin's Table Community, and longtime movement folk who have never failed to offer me hospitality whenever I've come to the Twin Cities. So thank you, Clemenses. And thank you, Jesus Radicals, for inviting me to be in the circle. In the early mid-1990s, I recall distinctly having pretty vigorous conversation on the infamous third floor of Ammon Hennessy House of the Los Angeles Catholic Worker in East LA. This is a place we've done Bible study together for about 25 years now. And we were, in the early mid-90s, a number of us were feeling that insofar as the Catholic worker movement is one of the flagships, so to speak, of Christian anarchism in this country, a number of us felt like, there wasn't really adequate exploration of the anarchist tradition in theory and practice in the Catholic worker movement. There are a lot of sound bites and assumptions and sort of a thin ethos, but not a lot of exploration, not a lot of literacy in the tradition and traditions of Christian anarchism. And so as we were wringing our hands about that, lo and behold, a few years later, Jesus Radicals sets up a site and has become, I think, in many ways, one of the best places for both the articulation and dissemination of the various strands of Christian anarchism. So thanks to Jesus Radicals for really filling a very great need that was perceived by a lot of us for a long time, and strength for continuing your work. And thank all of you for all the different ways that you got yourself to Minneapolis for this gathering. I know for many of you it's a gathering of the clan, and it's really a privilege to be a part of this circle this weekend. One of the lessons seared into me and as a young aspiring radical Christian disciple was learned at Jonah House Community in Baltimore. They weren't much into interior decorating back at the old house on Park Avenue. But there was one part of the interior decorating that I've never forgotten, and that was an old dog-eared, stained poster that was sort of half falling off the wall that I saw every day as I'd go up and down the stairs. And it simply said this: the most apostolic duty of all is to keep one another's courage up. And that continues to speak to my condition, as the Quakers say, and I hope that something in what I say this afternoon can be of encouragement to you, because that's what I want to be about, is encouraging each of you and you all collectively in your discipleship, in your work of resistance and renewal. It's really been great for me to experience my first Jesus Radicals gathering, in part because there's so many great young activist scholars doing great reflection in all sorts of different directions, and it's really fun to meet many of you who I have not met before. So thanks for all the work that you all do and bring here to the community. This is a gathering of the clan, but it's also a type of school, and these types of spaces for alternative pedagogy could not be more important in this historical moment to both our ecclesial movements and our political movements. So now as I attempted to listen to the Spirit about what to talk about, what came up was that maybe a useful thing might be to just tell a little bit of my story as just one narrative of the pilgrimage that we are all on. And so I want to start by sharing a little bit in sort of four acts, I guess. And it's not easy for me to share personally because I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, and we never like to talk about ourselves. But you know, I do think storytelling is important, and I do believe in biography as theology for all of us. This is the basic stuff of our discipleship that we bring. Like probably everybody else in the room, I came from a fractured family. In my case, it was a family in which class lines ran like a fault right through my parents' marriage. My dad was half Chicano. My mom was decidedly waspish. Dad grew up poor. My mom, well, her father was in the oil business in the 1920s and 30s. So it was really, you know, there was a fair bit of tension, but not a tension that was ever articulated, so you just pick up on that. And my dad was a lapsed Catholic. My mom was a lapsed Protestant. I wasn't raised in any kind of faith. And I was growing up on the tail end of the 60s. And what that meant is that when my brother was dispatched, my older brother was dispatched to Vietnam in 1969, I was 14. And my experience of the war was letters from my brother Rob from Indochina that he wrote in Elvish. For those of you who are Tolkienites, when he knew he was going to be sent over, he sat down and taught me enough Elvish so I could decipher his letters, because he wanted to say stuff he didn't want my parents or the U.S. government understanding. Because he was, like many people in that generation, he was an anti-war activist who was collared and sent off to fight the empire's war. So that was a pretty interesting, vantage point on the war as a young adolescent. And so when I came to the faith, which, well, the other thing that was really shaping for me was I was an exchange student in Scandinavia in 1972, and also experienced the war through the Scandinavian press, which was largely uncensored compared to the American press, particularly because you'd get press reports from Hanoi and from China. I remember one of the existential moments of my life being standing on a freezing street corner in a small, gritty industrial town in Norway, seeing the headlines of the bombing of Cambodia, and thinking to myself, great, now I get to try to defend the bombing of Cambodia to all my Norwegian friends, which of course I wasn't remotely interested in doing. So, like all of you, I was pretty alienated from a pretty early age. And so when I came to the faith, in large part as an attempt to try to deal with alienation in the world, I immediately found this double, or this ambivalent experience of being deeply attracted to the gospel and deeply repelled by my experience of church in Orange County in Southern California. Fortunately for me and my faith journey, within a few years of being a Christian and just having the completely demoralizing experience of attending small little conservative churches because I didn't know there was anything else, I began to meet folk from the radical Christian community, and that saved me, saved my faith, and I've told the story in other places that a few of you might have heard before. I won't repeat it now, but I really feel like my baptism into the radical discipleship movement happened in a dumpster before dawn, somewhere in a industrial terminal in Baltimore, where I was dumpster diving with Philip Berrigan, and he started asking me in the middle of the dumpster dive what I felt hope was and where Christian hope was, and then he started ranting about false Christian hope and bourgeois Christianity, and finally culminated his Amos-like rant in the dumpster with the phrase, if you want to know where hope is, he said, hope is where your ass is. You know, your talk, your rhetoric, your fantasies, none of that means anything. What counts is where you have placed your body in political space. That is what bespeaks of hope or hopelessness. And that had a pretty big impact on me. And so I want to just sketch out very briefly 4 chapters of my own attempt to place my ass in strategic space. My first orientation, I guess, in the mid-late 70s was with people like Dan and Philip Berrigan and Liz McAllister and others in the Catholic left, Catholic worker movement. And from them, I learned a thoroughgoing critique of empire from a Christian standpoint. And 35 years ago, that stuff wasn't in the air in the way it is today. Very, very few people anywhere along the ecumenical spectrum were talking about empire. It was really in the sort of Stringfellow tradition that they were talking about this. And that was just very, very formative for me. I also learned from them the disciplines, living in intentional community as a spiritual discipline of discipleship, and simple living and living proximate to the poor. I learned about going to jail as a spiritual discipline, much more than as a political spectacle. And I guess above all, what I learned from those folks was, as Thomas Merton famously put it in the darkest days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he said, Christian hope begins when all other hope stands frozen stiff in the face of the unspeakable. Now, in 1962 and again in 1976, the unspeakable was the very real possibility that in order to resolve their hegemonic competition for rule of the world, that the two great empires were going to unleash thermonuclear war. You know, I was part of the generation that went to elementary school crawling under desks with air raid drills and all of that I know you've all heard about, but haven't had the pleasure perhaps of experiencing. That stuff tends to impact you. So for all those things in that first chapter of my journey were really, really significant and continue to be significant for me. But one of the transition points for me came in 1980 when I was introduced to people who, particularly indigenous people, who were struggling all along the spectrum of the nuclear fuel cycle, who were struggling with the business end of military colonialism and nuclear domination. And I began to hear the world through their lens, which was a very different lens on the same phenomenon. And to sort of simplify it, what they would gently and not so gently say to us is, well, you know, y'all are rightly concerned about the end of the world, thermonuclear destruction, but you're talking about a potential apocalypse. We're experiencing that right now through your uranium mines and your atmospheric testing and your forward basing strategies. Right now, before a bomb is ever fired in anger, our lives are being destroyed in the continuing colonization that's been going on for 5 centuries. And that really refocused the whole thing for me. And so I began an apprenticeship with working with indigenous peoples movements throughout the Pacific Basin, and began to, you know, do the work both inward and outward politically around race and class. The difference between eschatological violence, the violence that might happen in the future, and existential violence, the violence that happens daily among people on the margins. And that was mixed with the fact that our community in the Bay Area at the time was in on the ground floor of the sanctuary movement that was attempting to deal with people coming up from the various counterinsurgency wars in Central America. So on both those fronts, I was beginning to have my eyes opened about the business end of American imperialism. And so that began a journey which sort of started out as a journey in peacemaking, became a much deeper journey in solidarity and in self-confrontation. And it was also, parenthetically, my first experience with very, very traditional peoples. I had the opportunity to be living in places that were really just a couple of generations into their encounter with the West. And that also rocked my world. I remember being in a village in Micronesia one sultry afternoon, not unlike the present one, in the jungle, and I'd been at that point in my life maybe 9 years, you know, a real veteran in intentional Christian community. And, you know, it's hard. And we were just constantly struggling to make this community thing work and to practice mutual aid and to be cooperative and to share our stuff. And I was walking around this village and I was just going, man, you know, these folks, they don't have this really hierarchical division of labor, and they practice mutual aid every day, and they share their stuff freely, and they don't have to have 4 nights of meetings every week to figure it out. And that really began to work on me that what we were dealing with here, particularly in North America, is a really degraded anthropological condition. as a result of generations and generations of empire. And that's what stimulated a lot of my subsequent thinking. The third stage in my journey was that after doing a lot of regional and international solidarity work, I began to worry about the phenomenon that I saw both in myself but also in a lot of other North Americans doing international solidarity work, of the phenomenon of what I later came to call hypermetropia, which is an ophthalmological term, it's easy for me to say, in which I'm able to see clearly in direct relation to the distance from me. So I can see human rights problems very clearly in Colombia or East Timor, or I can see poverty in Chad or in the Philippines, but I can't see or engage those things across town. Because, you know, this was a time where a lot of people were going down to Central America and having their big exposure and getting radicalized, and then coming back and continuing to put their primary energy into solidarity with Central America, largely unengaged with local communities. And of course, those things continue today, but for me that was a real awakening. And nothing seared that more profoundly on my consciousness greater than the Los Angeles Uprising of 1992. I'm a fifth-generation Californian, grew up in Los Angeles. I've seen my city burn twice in my lifetime, and that tends to make a pretty big impression. Once when I was 10 and didn't understand what was going on, and once when I was, whatever I was, 37, and was on the streets trying to do some grassroots peacemaking in the midst of it all. Los Angeles Uprising was the largest, remains the largest civil uprising in the history of the United States. It was a big deal, and as you may recall or have heard, the great slogan scrawled on walls all across Los Angeles metropolis was "No justice, no peace." And so it was important for me to, again, for a third time now, to fundamentally realign my own discipleship in light of the huge demand in local solidarity and local issues of race and class and gender and sexuality. I was also very influenced by the fact that in the mid-90s, at the time of NAFTA, U.S. capital was massively structurally adjusting Mexico as well as elsewhere in the world and creating tens of thousands of economic refugees, only then to start Operation Gatekeeper to militarize the border to try to keep the very people that our economic policy was displacing out of the U.S. And so we were deeply involved in human rights work at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so again, those two things, the LA Uprising and the border wars, again, were a catechism in reality about empire and its discontents. So, you know, those were three great stages of development that were important in my particular journey. And when I passed the 20-year mark in the movement, which some of you in this room have been in the movement much longer than I have, but some of you are relatively new, and it is my prayer that you will pass the 20-year mark in the movement for yourselves, be around long enough to be reflecting on its meaning for you. Here's the big question. You know, when you start getting long in the tooth, you start asking questions about longevity and sustainability and how are you going to keep on keeping on and all those good things. And I certainly was beginning to ask those questions. They tend to come in direct relationship to your body beginning to break down. And so you have two questions. One is, can I keep doing this stuff at the same pace? A, and B, I wonder if there's going to be anybody to take care of me when I just completely collapse. And is all these years in the movement, what's it going to be worth when I'm too old to do anything useful or too broken down? And so, you start to ask those sorts of questions. And as you're asking the question, what keeps us going, and I'd had all these experiences with these different communities, I began to compare my own ethos, my own subculture in North American resistance and renewal circles with particularly a number of the traditional groups, indigenous peoples struggles that I'd had the great privilege of being part of. And what I found almost without exception is that the difference between first world movements and third or fourth world movements of resistance and renewal is that for the most part, traditional peoples are in struggle for something, whereas most of us tend to be in struggle against something. I understand that's a simplification, that's a broad brush, but I think there's a lot of truth in it. And a lot of us get a lot of our energy on that sort of negation of what is, because we see the pathology of it. But the reason why poor folk can struggle harder and longer than we can over generations is because I believe they're struggling for a way of life. They're struggling for protection of lifeways and of land. And most of us aren't entirely sure what it is we are struggling for. And so that's really the question that came up for me at that stage, really the mid-90s. And that was the moment in which I was introduced for the first time to a sort of a revolutionary set of ideas and practices that first were breaking out in the Pacific Northwest, the great land of Cascadia, which was sort of the birthplace of a lot of bioregionalist thought and practices. It also happened that at that time my father died, and I was suddenly, without inner preparation, dealing with lots of feelings of identity and my place as a fifth-generation person on the land. And so I began to investigate bioregionalism. I ran across green anarchism for the first time. And anyway, that journey took me to a place where, like the parable of Jesus, I felt like I needed to sell everything in order to buy the pearl of great price. And that's when, after almost 30 years in inner city scapes, we moved to the Ventura River watershed and began a new journey. A journey which Gary Snyder calls coming into the watershed, and that's what I want to talk about. But I feel it's necessary to talk about it in context, and in this case, the context of my own journey. And I say that because all four of these strands continue to be important to me, and I don't feel like each one eclipsed the other and made it irrelevant. To me, it was just a deepening and enriching and broadening of the fundamental insights of what resistance and renewal means in the radical discipleship movement. It's my conviction, as some of you know, and which is annoying to a few of you in the room, that I'm really an ecumenist when it comes to practices in the movement. I think we need everybody doing everything because it's an all-hands-on-deck moment, and I don't think there is one thing that everybody should be doing. I think all the diversity that's represented here in this gathering is all very, very important. We just don't do a very good job being ecumenical with one another, learning from each other, cross-training. We're much better at sort of excommunicating each other. So that's been a big theme for me because I myself have traveled such distances on the map of those issues and engagements. If Peter Lumsdaine is right, and Peter and I are sort of from the same generation, sort of getting to be old dudes. If he's right in terms of some of what he was saying last night, that GNR and ABC and the kind of horrors he was talking about last night aren't just new issues, but are signaling a new era. And I'm pretty much of that opinion as well. Then, although I would nuance it to say GNR, ABC technology, that what Peter calls the re-engineering crisis, I think is one aspect of the new era. I think global warming, peak oil, peak water, peak topsoil is also a part of the new era. I think it's unprecedented. The worsening stratification of wealth and the structural adjustment of the global economy to benefit the elite is historically unprecedented, not in kind, but in degree. And above all, as a result of all of those other factors, we as human beings, particularly those of us who come from privileged strata, are more displaced, more alienated, more hyper-globalized, which is to say lost, than any human beings ever in the history of the race. And so all of these are factors in the new era. And if, in fact, we are in that situation, and I believe most of you who are under 30 and have grown up with some of these specters, like I grew up with the specter of the H-bomb, you feel this stuff in your bones. That's why you're in this movement. So here we all are, and we're trying to figure out, so what do we do, and how do we think, and how do we practice the values and build the new world in the shell of the old. So we're over nationalism. We're still learning from Marxism, but have seen its limits. We're trying to figure out the anarchist tradition and its limits. Many in the room are attracted to primitivist kinds of engagements and critiques. But we are basically searching for a framework to deal with this new era. I really think that's the one thing that we have in common in this room, and that we're all trying to, the bone we're all sniffing around here. And I think one of the other things that unites us is that it's our intuition and perhaps also our experience that in this new era, some of the old traditions that we find in our faith and in our scripture might actually help us figure out that new/old framework. I am also searching for that framework, even as we all do our practices. And what's clear to me based on my journey is that our framework has to continue to have open eyes about empire in all its forms, both historically and at present. We have to give priority to the most marginalized among us and learn the world through their eyes. That's the experience I learned in remote villages. 3, we have to understand the local manifestations of the global pathologies that we have identified, and that we never outlive the politics of race, class, gender, and sexuality ever, because they're always with us, because they're the fabric of oppression in the world we live in. Obviously, part of this has to be strategies of economic sustainability. And above all, for me, in the chronology of my journey, the most important piece and the most difficult piece is we have to somehow figure out how to ground our theory and our practice in a profound sense of what we are struggling for, or of what the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which was really one of my great tutors, called simply aloha aina, a love for the land, but also a love that flows up into us and through us from the land. You can't experience aloha aina if you don't have a place that you actually love and are loved by. And that speaks directly to one of the greatest existential and psychological and spiritual crises of people like most of us in this room, which is our real sense of placelessness and lack of identity for those reasons. So we've been in our little place in California, we've been in the last few years really trying to shape and work at trying to figure out what a replaced Christian identity might look like. And the mantra for us, which I learned from some bioregionalists, is, you know, we all want to save stuff. We want to save people. We want to save the world. But when it comes to places, we can't save places we don't love. And that's demonstrable on the North American terrain today. One of the reasons that the tar sands holocaust in northern Alberta is going virtually unchallenged is that the only people who loved that place have been removed from that place. And urban Canadians who mostly live at the border, within 100 miles of the border, have never been up to where the tar sands holocaust is happening. I grew up in Southern California, as I said, and I've pretty much seen every place I ever loved destroyed in the strategy of overdevelopment. That works on you. It messes you up. And we destroy places because we don't love them. Wendell Berry has a lot of very good, I think, analysis on what he calls the rampaging group of professionals who are loyal to no place and who have no identity of place and so have become adept at destroying other people's places. What we also know as corporate capitalism. So we can't save places we don't love. But it's also true that we can't love places we don't know. And we can't know places we haven't learned. So one of the things I'm most interested is how we can begin to recover an old set of practices that have to do with bioregional literacy, or what some ecological philosophers call philopatria, which is a word that derives from the Greek for love of one's place or homeland. In ecological philosophy, it's used to describe the phenomenon of animals or people returning to the place they were born. You know how fish will swim upstream to go back to where they were spawned in order to spawn. That's, technically speaking, that's philopatria. That's the profound instinct and urge to become one with the place that birthed you. That's something that's almost been entirely destroyed by our industrial culture among us human beings. And that probably, if we're going to relearn it, we can only relearn it from animals and from the natural world. But it seems to me that we need less patriotism and more philopatria. Theologically and ecologically, it seems well past time that rather than the nationalist constructs of ideology, economics, and even ethnicity, particularly as ethnicity is constructed in the imperial sphere, rather than those things shaping our loyalties and identities, that we need to be about a new project of fundamentally having our loyalties and identities shaped by the land and by place. So the term bioregionalism comes from the Greek word bio, for life, and regira, the Latin regira, territory. Together they convey life territory, a place defined by all of its life forms, its topography, its biota, rather than by its built environment, human dictates, governed by nature, not legislature. And if that concept initially strikes us as strange, it's only because we've become so distant to that. That's how human beings lived for all but the last 10,000 years of our time on the planet. So it's a new, but it's also a very old paradigm, and I believe it needs to become the central paradigm for our discipleship on a planet on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I believe that it can form one of the foundations of the new framework that we are looking for. And in order to understand most easily the idea of bioregionalism, it's helpful to begin with what is most basic to life, and that is water, which is why we sang the little water song. Wherever we reside, in the city, in the suburbs, in rural areas, or in hermetic caves, wherever we live, our place is defined by a larger system called a watershed. And a watershed is that area that is drained by a watercourse and all its tributaries into particular other bodies of waters, ponds, lakes, ocean. And all of us live in one. No matter how ignorant we may be about the watershed we actually live in. We may not be native to that watershed, we may not be literate in that watershed, but we live in a watershed. Even if we live in a built environment where we can't even discern which way the water runs. John Wesley Powell was the first non-indigenous person to run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in 1869, and actually he's got still the best definition of a watershed. He says it's that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse. All living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse. And whereas humans settled, simple logic demanded that humans become a part of that hydrological community. Now, of course, that's not how we have settled on the land. We have settled on the land in ways that absolutely defy and destroy the integrity of watersheds. But that's what we're trying to recover and relearn. Each watershed is made up of a unique mix of habitats that influence each other, including forests and wetlands, fields, meadows, rivers, lakes, farms, and cities. So just close your eyes for a minute and think about where you live. And try to think of the watercourse that is closest to you. It might be a local creek or river, or it might be a culvert running under the street. But water's running somewhere. The area that is covered where that water runs, from the water's origination to the landscapes that it passes through to its endpoint, that is your watershed. Now, Brock Dolman is a permaculturist in Northern California, and he believes that the only way that we are going to halt our civilizational slide into ecological disaster is to reorient our thinking toward what he calls watershed consciousness. Watersheds, he writes, underlie all human endeavors and form the foundation for all future aspirations and survival. And then he talks about the idea of a cradle, or even a lifeboat. A container where water flows and collects from the ridges down into the basins and flows down, making its way to the bigger bodies of water. So the precipitation hits the ridges and flows either into your watershed or into a neighboring one. And every living organism within this basin, whether it knows it or not, and most of us don't know it, is interconnected and dependent on the health of that watershed. So Dolman goes on to write, where we can have social, local, intentional community with other life forms and inanimate processes like the fire cycle and the hydrological cycle, that's our watershed. And that should be the applied scale, geographic scale of our experiments in sustainability. All of which must be regenerative because all of our watersheds are, to varying degrees, profoundly degraded. And we are never going to come back to life as people or as social groups until and unless we restore every single watershed on the planet. So he concludes, we're perched on the tipping point of what he calls a watershed moment. Now's the time to bring our communities together to set in motion plans and processes to ensure that our watersheds will remain healthy in perpetuity. And then he cups his hands and he says, our watershed is our lifeboat, whether we know it or not.